I work at the headquarters of the U.S. Patent and Trademark Office in Alexandria, Virginia. It's the latest home for our agency. We've been in there just a little over a decade. But our roots run deep, and we have some reminders of that on our campus. I work in the Madison building, next to the Jefferson building. So why Madison? Why Jefferson? In 1787, at the Constitutional Convention in Philadelphia, James Madison proposed the provision creating the constitutional basis for our organization. Article 1, Section 8 of the Constitution grants Congress the power to promote the progress of science and the useful arts by securing for limited times to authors and inventors the exclusive right to their respective writings and discoveries. Earlier this year, we celebrated the 225th anniversary of that first patent statute. It was passed by the Congress of the 12 United States and signed by President Washington into law on April 10th, 1790. Rhode Island didn't join the Union until May 29th, so we had our first patent system even before we had our 13th state. That first patent statute created a three-person patent board led by the Secretary of State, Thomas Jefferson, and assisted by the Secretary of War and the Attorney General. The statute defined what, but not how, that law should be implemented. So Jefferson had to invent the process. He became the first patent examiner. In the first year of the board, 1 patent was issued. In the second, 33. Jefferson was a brilliant individual, but a brilliant individual does not scale. Recognizing this, Jefferson proposed changes, setting in motion the constant evolution our organization requires to meet the demands of increasing scale, complexity, and rate of change. Fast forward to today, and patent applications exceed over 600,000 each year. Director of the U.S. Patent and Trademark Office, Michelle K. Lee, leads a workforce of almost 13,000 employees. Today, our mission is far more complex than that of the original patent board. We're responsible for fostering innovation, competitiveness, and economic growth, domestically and abroad, by delivering high-quality examination of patent and trademark applications. But we're also charged with guiding domestic and international intellectual property policy and delivering intellectual property information and education worldwide with a highly skilled, diverse workforce. That diverse workforce is one of our strengths. In August, Director Lee delivered the keynote at the Girls Who Code graduation at Georgetown University. She mentioned that our examining corps contains 50% more women in STEM fields than U.S. industry at large, and that while women represent less than 15% of executive officers in the nation, at the USPTO, women hold more than 30% of our senior executive positions. Waves of new IT technology were implemented at USPTO in the 70s, 80s, and 90s. But as we entered this century, the effectiveness of old IT paradigms began to decay. We needed to replace extensive suites of legacy applications with new next-generation applications, and the decision was made to use agile software development methodologies to do that. As we started in on that agile development, it soon became aware that DevOps was the next thing that we had to pursue. There are many aspects of our ongoing DevOps transformation at USPTO. Today, I'd like to focus on one of the important ones. I believe that both learning and teaching are an essential aspect of accelerating a DevOps transformation. One of the powerful ideas that has influenced me came from Andrew Schaefer's 2013 Velocity Talk. You are either building a learning organization or you will be losing to someone who is. A corollary for this conference is that you are either accelerating your DevOps transformation by continually improving learning and teaching, or you will be losing to someone who is. I'd like to share 3 types of our experiences with learning and teaching DevOps at USPTO. First, sending people out. This really was the essential precursor for our DevOps transformation. In the early 90s, we were sending people to conferences and they got exposed to open source software tools. So we came across security tools like Tripwire and Nessus, brought the code in, compiled it, experimented with it, and started to see value from those kinds of things. Early versions of CF Engine became our first experience with infrastructure as code. We started pulling in more open source tools for performance, monitoring, other tasks. And those early small experiments with open source software eventually built enough confidence that we went into widespread adoption of open source software up and down our tech stack. Another aspect of sending people out has involved sending people to local meetups. We're fortunate in the DC metro area to have a really vibrant meetup scene, and there is an excellent DevOps meetup that meets monthly in there. We've got our folks exposed to a lot of new ideas, made contacts with the community, and found that to be really beneficial. And one of the aspects that I think is available to any organization in this notion of sending people out is that it can grow not only the skills of individuals, but also of a team and even the wider community. And I think the real exemplar for this kind of practice is Etsy. They have a notion called generosity of spirit. And to Etsy, what that means is their engineers strive to either give a conference talk, write a technical blog on Etsy's Code is Kraft blog, or contribute to an open source project at least once a year. We've directly been the beneficiary of that kind of generosity. And at PTO, we're striving to give back to the community as well. Second type of experience, exploring upstream. Initially for us, this was exploring upstream in the sense of open source upstream projects. We started getting involved in beta tests with software that was destined to flow down into our supported open source tech stacks. We also started looking for more tools to fill gaps and drew heavily on upstream open source to do that. Another aspect of this exploring upstream became looking upstream for new ideas from non-IT domains. So we brought in things like blameless postmortem and Kanban that have their roots in domains that weren't IT fields at all, but have provided tremendous value in the pursuit of DevOps. And a last aspect of this exploring upstream had to do with the way our teams worked with each other. We started getting our ops teams exploring upstream within our own organization, collaborating more closely with the developers who would flow their product down into our ops teams. And they reciprocated with that collaboration. I'd like to give kind of one case in point of some of this upstream exploration. When we started this transition to Agile and to DevOps, we had a legacy configuration management system, and that obviously had to be replaced, and we needed to implement a continuous integration pipeline. So we looked at the available options, and we built a predominantly open source stack centered around Subversion, Jenkins, Nexus, Sonar, and Selenium. Put together a new team to do that, and the internal acronym for that project was called CICM. That became one of the huge early success stories in the first parts of our DevOps transformation. And just to touch briefly on some of the benefits, the kind of thing that's familiar to all of us and talked about a lot. So just a few little aspects of that. We pulled all the legacy code out of that old configuration management tool, got it into this new stack. We now have 161 project repositories in CICM. Average build time has fallen from 3 hours to under 15 minutes and now includes automated testing that used to not be included in that metric. Average daily build frequency has gone to over 1,500 and can peak at over 2,800. To us, compared to our old past practice with the legacy system, that was just a massive gain. But one of the things that kind of surprised me and is relevant to today's topic was that we started getting some benefits that weren't really the initial goal of that CICM project at all. It became a springboard for learning, for teaching, for further exploration. Case in point, we had an existing infrastructure as code capability set up with several different tools, but there was this gap that was affecting, in that capability, that was affecting this CICM project. So we looked upstream for open source, found Ansible, brought down the code, experimented with it. It satisfied the need. We incorporated it into the CICM stack. It's there today, fulfilling the need for us. Another aspect was back to this notion of teams collaborating with each other. So our infrastructure teams from my area, had to collaborate closely with the CICM team just to stand this new capability up. And we had independently started doing source control for our infrastructure as code with Git, even though CICM was using Subversion for the application development. But through that collaboration and the connections that that team built, we began to see that it would be nice to leverage their tools, to leverage Jenkins and some of the other tools in their tool chain. So they were accommodating, had no problem integrating with our Git repos, and now we have our infrastructure as code in 2-week sprints, automated with Jenkins, and doing automated testing, and we're expanding the breadth and depth of that kind of approach with our infrastructure as code. So another benefit to that kind of exploration upstream. The next experience has been bringing people in. And this has taken on a lot of different aspects. We have brought in guest speakers like Gene Kim and Mike McGarr from Netflix. We brought in people to some internal events that we hosted, and here was one of the many ways in which we were direct beneficiaries of Etsy's generosity of spirit. Etsy's Daniel Schauenberg and Ryan France came in January of this year to an event that we hosted, and both gave excellent keynote talks during that conference that we hosted at PTO. Another thing that we did was brought in some outside expertise to train on DevOps topics, including things like Kanban and blameless postmortems. And one of the interesting takeaways from that was that most often in the past, our training had centered around specific functional teams. But when we started training on these DevOps techniques, there in the session on something like Kanban or postmortem would be a sysadmin, a build manager, one of our IT security specialists, an application developer, and we started making connections, not only learning the content that was taught in the course, but learning each other's needs and gaining more empathy. Those connections have grown and thrived and becomes this kind of beautiful second order effect of the training which was needed, but we got this team building because of the way we were doing the training. Another aspect of bringing people in is bringing people into the decision-making process. Recently, our CIO, John Owens, started up an initiative to storyboard our DevOps future. So we have a group of our senior IT executives and a group of our senior technical staff spending several hours in a session every couple weeks, First, we went through some of the global issues and laid out things that we would need to work on to improve our DevOps practice. Next, we've started going role by role and saying, in our ideal future state, what's going to be the experience of a developer? And we spent a session on that. Then what's going to be the experience of one of our test teams? And we're still working through that. We're taking our time on it, but it's bringing people in and it's bringing ideas in. And it's another thing that I think is really going to help accelerate our DevOps transformation. A last part of bringing people in has been making ourselves available to collaborate with the local community. I mentioned the DevOps days, or excuse me, the DevOps DC monthly meetup, and they move around the DC metro area, and they host themselves in different venues. Last November, we offered to, for the first time, let them use our venue for one of the meetups. And coincidentally, prior to the meetup was the first session of the organizing committee for what became DevOps Days DC. Almost serendipitously, we got involved in that, and it became an important part of our story. We got involved with the organizing committee and continued to work through that process. They had a couple dozen candidate venues, but eventually they chose to host the first DevOps Days in the DC metro area at our agency, and our collaboration with them intensified, and we got some wonderful results out of that. Just a few things to touch on quickly there. If you're familiar with Mark Schwartz and the wonderful talk that he gave at this conference last year, he gave a keynote address that's a beautiful companion piece to his last year's DevOps Enterprise Summit address. One of the interesting takeaways out of that was that we had the organizing committee decide that we would pull the speakers from within a 100-mile radius of Washington. And we were able to pull that off, and it kind of makes the point that talent is available locally, either in your community or in your organization. It's wonderful to bring people in from outside, but that shouldn't be a barrier. You can do stuff with the people that you have. I believe that a good question posed to the community can be more valuable than a prescription from just one person. So I want to try something different for this part of my presentation, and I'm asking for your help here. I'll pose some questions for you to consider in the context of your own organization, and I've got some references at the end of the slide deck. Afterwards, after we go through these 7 questions, I'll ask you for your answers, and we'll have a chance to share some of that. So first question, how are you handling technical debt? One of the aspects of this that I think of is expanding the original definition from application software to include any gap or obsolescence in hardware, software, skill set, or mindset. How are you making sense of complexity? What do you need to unlearn? And here I think this is something that we're starting to see a recurring theme in a lot of DevOps discussions. Certainly at this conference, it occurred at our DevOps Days DC. A lot of what we're doing in DevOps is counterintuitive, and there are things that we need to unlearn. We need to unlearn deeply ingrained cognitive biases. We need to unlearn the Cartesian, Newtonian worldview that we all grow up in school with, that says that there's a clockwork universe, every problem can be neatly decomposed and we can trace back to a single root cause. It doesn't happen in the complex adaptive systems that we need to handle with DevOps. One of the things that strikes me is the impact of Taylor's notions of scientific management down to this day. The founder of Panasonic, Konosuke Matsuhita, said that our heads had become Taylorized. And I found that this is kind of a really intriguing notion. How did that happen? And how do we address that? But certainly there's some things that we need to unlearn. One of the exemplary ways this is done at Etsy is that when they onboard people, John Allspaw conducts internal postmortem facilitation courses. Why? Because facilitating one of those courses successfully isn't innate. It's not something we know. To do it well, we both have to unlearn some deeply ingrained ways of thinking, as well as learn some new skills. What can we learn from other domains? Certainly aviation safety and wildfire management have brought up a lot of ideas that are being applied to DevOps. And I think the potential to pull in ideas from non-IT domains is one of those things that can accelerate our transformation. Is imagination causing problems? Now, I'm not speaking of the imagination that causes innovation, but the gap between work as imagined and work as done as described by Eric Holnagel and others. How do you close that gap? How can teaching and learning be continually improved? For one thing, perhaps we could apply DevOps practices to that teaching and learning, do retrospectives after teaching exercises, apply Kaizen principles, maybe Gemba walks if it's important for management to go and see where and how the work is being done. Maybe it's also important for management to go and see where and how the teaching and learning is being done. Lastly, how do you positively influence the ideas of your IT people? In the Phoenix project at the end, and also in IT Revolution's manifesto, there's a call to positively influence the lives of IT people. There are so many dimensions of DevOps to focus on that I think it's possible for this one to get lost in the crowd. But I believe that focusing on this improvement can accelerate all the other aspects of a DevOps transformation. So your answers to these questions, I'll put them up for reference, and we've got mics in the room. All I see is bright lights.
All right, beyond the lights, I see people taking photographs of the screen, and that's not answering the question. Big one. Have the things here. Come on, is the post-lunch? All right, okay, we have a finger up here. Okay, let's go.
Hi, thank you. I don't have an answer, but on the topic of technical debt, from a pragmatic perspective, we consider the rates are low. So we just kind of let it accumulate while we focus on keeping the lights on and achieving business goals. So I'm very curious how others will answer this question.
Yeah, I think technical debt is one of the key questions. Any other thoughts on that? Other answers or any of the other questions?
Actually, I have an answer on that one, which is that when you have the difference between project-based and product-based teams, if you have a project-based team where you build a thing and hand it to operations, you're creating technical debt every time you do that handover. If you have a product-oriented team that owns the evolution of something, you're continuously retiring that technical debt because you're evolving it, and you can do experiments, and you're building an evolutionary architecture. So I think that once you get over that transition, the technical debt problem is greatly reduced. You still have it, but it's naturally, the problem of the debt goes directly back to the developers that created it and that can manage it and make it go away, rather than being somebody else's problem. And that breaking that loop, I think, is key to getting through that. A question.
Said I can answer the first one on how we're handling technical debt. As I became part of the organization, we had a significant number of 2003 servers. We've got a lot of vertical applications, monster databases that are heavily cross-connected, and as you were saying before, that you were just paying the debt and letting it pile up. Well, I had a pile that was just like credit card debt. It just got to the point to where you can't pay it enough. And Well, we've reached our credit limit, so to speak, and we just had to do it. So by collecting the development people with the operations people, and we even throw in security because you just have to do it anymore, and put it together, we deconstructed what all was needed to break these monoliths up and move them forward. It's a tremendous amount of work, but you don't have a choice, really. You have to do this. And everybody just has knuckled under and started accepting it, embracing that DevOpsSec process, and going through it. And slowly and surely, the wheel begins to turn, the pile comes down, things get paid off, we move forward. As new operations come in, they go through the DevOpsSec process. As we retire older systems, I don't have to pay that debt because we retired it, so it's gone. We've decommissioned it out of the process now. We went from 147 heavily complicated and monolithic monster applications down to about 38 that are still left to be done. And we've done this in about 8.5 months. So it's not an easy thing to do. It's, again, like paying off the credit card debt. You just eat a lot of beans and rice sometimes and pay the bills.
Well, thanks. I appreciate that. And I think one of the values of that in a kind of a second order effect is when you free up the cycles from what you were just describing, now you can start going after some of these other problems. Other answers?
Right. I don't think I'm going to be able. Sorry, I don't think I'm going to be able to move through all 7. But I think one of the things about handling technical debt that I see is really shining a light that management understands what the drag of that technical debt is on further progress. There's so many stakeholders that are willing to pony up budget initially to amount technical debt, and quite often don't even understand the accretive effects of doing so. So I think, in some degree, letting folks understand how that's actually adding to the complexity of your environment. And when you ask the question, how are you making sense of complexity? I find that a pretty interesting question. There was a Harvard Business Review that actually went and identified what is the difference between complicated and complexity. And to a large degree, I see anything that involves human beings as highly complex, given that we're infinitely unique. But understanding the interdependencies and how those interdependencies change on time. And like anything else, breaking things down to smaller elements and chipping away. I'm sure there's a lot of other folks who have ideas, but those were just 2 points.
Well, thanks. I appreciate you mentioning that. And you mentioned that Harvard Business Review, which is David Snowden's 2007 issue there. And that is one of the most accessible ways to get into Snowden and the Cynefin complex. So thank you for bringing that up. I think need to move into final time to wrap up here. So let me just quickly go through, and the top 5 takeaways will be there in the slide deck after we're done, and these things are posted up on the SharePoint. What I'm looking for help for is measuring cultural change. I know that there are global efforts like the DevOps Enterprise, or excuse me, the State of DevOps report, which I think are really helpful. But if anyone has any experience report on measuring that within an organization year over year, I think that would be a huge help. So the promised references, some general ones, and then specifically a couple not meant to be exhaustive, but meant to be thought-provoking on each of those 7 questions. And at the end, I think Masahita's points here really reinforce Schaefer's notion of the imperative to become a learning organization. So I found those very useful. Thank you very much.